In the cold, dark cellar, Geralt of Rivia moved slowly, surrounded by skeletal corpses with hollow eyes and the haunting whisper of cursed, cursed, reverberating around him. Despite the deathly atmosphere, his face remained calm, showing no fear or despair. His sharp eyes scanned his surroundings, cautious and alert. Geralt called out in his steady voice, "Vara? Vara, where the hell'd you go?" But he knew well that Vara, the cunning succubus, had lured him into this trap and vanished without a trace. Rather than feeling anger or panic, Geralt kept his familiar cold expression, ready for any threat that might arise. He took careful steps backward toward the staircase, where a faint light from the lone torch flickered against the damp stone walls, illuminating the darkened hallway. The light's presence only made the atmosphere more chilling, but Geralt's focus was unshaken. One of the corpses drew close to him, its twisted face and raspy voice echoing curse. Without hesitation, Geralt raised his hand, concentrated his energy, and firmly uttered, "Ard!" A powerful blast shot forth, pushing the undead away with a resounding boom that reverberated through the eerie space. Geralt pressed onward, each step crunching over fragments of broken bones beneath his boots. His unyielding gaze was fixed straight ahead, never looking back, even as the undead continued to close in. He had to find a way out of this place, not out of fear or despair, but from the steely resolve of a battle-hardened warrior who would not yield to any challenge. Fully aware that this was the cursed trap Vara had set for him, as the skeletal corpses closed in, Geralt stood firm, his expression cold and unyielding. Around him, the eerie chant of cursed, cursed, echoed in the gloomy, decayed space, a relentless reminder of the danger that surrounded him. The corpses pressed forward, twisted and ravenous, their hollow eyes locked on him with a dark, relentless hunger. Without hesitation, Geralt raised his hand and shouted, "Igni!" Flames burst forth, fierce and blazing, surging toward the approaching corpses. The fire roared through them, engulfing them in an intense blaze with a thunderous whoosh that illuminated the cellar in searing red light. The undead shrieked and recoiled, their bodies igniting as the fire forced them back, at least momentarily. But his relief was short-lived. As the flames subsided, one corpse lunged at him, its bony fingers gripping his arm with unnatural strength. Geralt struggled, wrenching his arm, but the creature's grip tightened, dragging him further into the encroaching horde. He grimaced as the skeletal fingers dug into his skin, the coldness of death seeping into him. Refusing to surrender, Geralt fought against the tightening mass of bodies. He reached for his sword, using all his strength to push one creature away, only for more to fill the gap, their chilling chant echoing ceaselessly, "Cursed, cursed." Like an inescapable curse woven into the air. Trapped in the relentless grasp of these undead beings, Geralt felt himself being pulled deeper into the darkness, his breath stifled by the swarm closing in around him. Surrounded by the relentless horde of skeletal corpses, Geralt stood unflinching. "Ard, you bastards!" he roared, raising his hand to unleash a powerful magical force. A tremendous blast resounded. Wool-wumph, scattering the undead in every direction, their bodies flung like discarded puppets, falling lifelessly to the ground around him. Breathing heavily, Geralt knelt down, exhausted but vigilant, taking in the remnants of the shattered corpses that littered the floor. His reprieve was brief. As he knew the danger was far from over, he had to find a way out, and fast. Without wasting a second, Geralt sprinted up the staircase, feeling the undead closing in behind him. Reaching a higher step, he turned and extended his hand once more, unleashing another Ard blast. "Ard!" he shouted, and the powerful force erupted, hurling the pursuing corpses backward in a wave of energy that shattered their ranks. As Geralt finally reaches the cellar hatch, a faint glimmer of light from the room above spills over him, a welcome sign of escape. He strides up the last few steps with determination, but just as he's about to pull himself out, a skeletal hand clutches his ankle, pulling him back. "Ugh! Get your moldy claws off me!" he snarls, struggling against the corpse's iron grip. The creature's hollow eyes meet his as it murmurs, cursed. Again and again, like a relentless incantation, Geralt grits his teeth, refusing to be dragged back. With a surge of power, he yells, "Ard!" A blast of magic erupts from him, shattering the dried skull of his undead attacker with a resounding whoosh. Bone fragments scatter in all directions, and the hand finally releases him. He stumbles forward, falling into the room above with a heavy slam. His chest heaves as he catches his breath, his mind racing with adrenaline. Just then, he hears his name called from the darkness. Geralt. Is it Jacob calling out? Or perhaps another threat lurking in the shadows, waiting to strike? Geralt tenses, drawing his sword, ready for whatever challenge awaits in the murky silence beyond. Emerging from the cellar, his armor battered and his face shadowed with exhaustion, Geralt fixes his steely gaze on Jacob and Vara. Jacob's expression shifts to shock as he takes in the Witcher's condition. "Gods, man! Look at you! Are you all right?" Jacob stammers, concern in his voice. Geralt's response is cold and terse. "I'll live. Ran into some trouble." Without another word, he strides forward, drawing his sword. His attention snaps to Vara, and in a sudden, brutal move, he grabs her by the throat, slamming her against the wall. Vara gasps, her eyes wide in terror as Geralt's grip tightens. "And the fight's not over," he growls, his voice dripping with barely restrained anger. Vara, struggling in his grasp, stammers in desperation. I saw what they become, and I panicked and ran. I thought you were with me." Her voice is broken, her words pleading, but Geralt's hand remains firm, pressing her further against the wall. "You tried to kill me. Feed me to those creatures in the cellar," he snarls, his voice low and full of fury. Vara's face is pale, her expression stricken as she tries to explain. "Geralt, please. I didn't know those men were." "Whatever they are," she gasps, her voice barely a whisper, fear evident in her every word. Jacob steps forward, alarmed at the escalation. "Geralt, calm down," he says, his tone urgent, trying to diffuse the tension. Geralt spares Jacob a glance, but his hand doesn't budge from Vara's throat. Vara, trembling, forces out a whisper, I just wanted to show you the cellar. I didn't know that would happen." Her gaze drops, helpless under Geralt's fierce glare. With a final, bitter look, Geralt loosens his grip and steps back, releasing her. His voice is a sharp blade as he finishes. "Set me down those stairs and left me to die. That's what you did." He glares at Vara, his eyes filled with anger and betrayal. Vara slumps, visibly shaken, as the weight of Geralt's words hangs in the air, a reminder of her treachery and his unrelenting resolve. As Geralt held his sword near Vara's throat, Jacob quickly stepped in, his tone urgent and pleading. "Geralt, hold, man. This woman sought me out, begged for help. We came running to save you." Geralt's golden eyes shifted to Jacob, his gaze cold and unyielding. But as Jacob continued, "Would she do that if she wanted you dead?" Geralt's expression softened just slightly, a faint sign of restraint as Jacob's words sank in. Returning his intense gaze to Vara, he loosened his grip on her neck, but didn't release her entirely. Vara trembled, her back pressed against the wall, trying to muster her voice. "Those men. Last I knew, they were alive," she whispered, her eyes darting between Jacob and Geralt, searching for understanding. She swallowed hard and continued, "I didn't know they'd become monsters. I couldn't have known they would attack." After a tense pause, Geralt's stern face seemed to consider her words. Finally, he lowered his sword and released her, though his expression remained guarded. "They were alive? How long ago was that?" he questioned, his voice sharp with suspicion. Vara stammered, struggling to recall. "A week? 2? Maybe more." Her voice wavered, as if unsure even of her own memory. She glanced at the stained glass window, her voice taking on a far-off tone. "Time moves strangely in this house. They stood there in uneasy silence, each weighed down by the eerie, unpredictable presence of the house, as the distorted colors of the stained glass cast foreboding shadows around them, heightening the sense that something darker lay just beneath the surface. With a slight hesitation, Geralt looked down, muttering, "Sorry, it's just that I thought," Jacob, visibly frustrated, stepped closer and interrupted him passionately. "No, you weren't thinking at all. You can't treat a woman that way." His voice rose, filled with a fervor that surprised even Geralt. "Women are divine creatures, Witcher. They command our respect," Jacob continued, his eyes gleaming as he spoke. "No man can understand a woman, not ever. Their reasons are too mysterious, too chaotic." His tone was filled with a reverence, as if he were defending something sacred. Jacob pressed on without giving Geralt a chance to respond. "We must accept them for what they are, and accept that their lives are far too short. They can be taken from us at any time. So you can't just draw your damn sword and wave it about like you're some sort of Having released his pent-up emotion, Jacob placed a steadying hand on Geralt's shoulder, as if to soothe both of them. I'm sorry, Witcher. It's this house. It's this creature that once was Marta. I'm far too tense. Feel like I'm boiling." Geralt stayed silent, his face giving nothing away. He didn't reply, but in the quiet that followed, a mutual understanding seemed to settle between them. Both of them knew that whatever was happening in this house was beyond anything they could fully grasp. They'd need to keep calm if they wanted to handle whatever came next in this strange, unpredictable place. Geralt gripped his medallion tightly, feeling its familiar vibration, a signal of something incredibly dangerous nearby. His voice was low and sharp as he said, "I understand, Jacob. I feel it too. My medallion's been vibrating ever since we entered this house." His gaze landed on the sturdy latch on the door ahead. Geralt continued, "There's a powerful curse here. Good thing there's a strong latch." The three of them, Geralt, Jacob, and Vara, stepped into the large room before them, dim light filtering through the stained glass window, casting strange shapes on the floor. The window, adorned with images of beasts, seemed to tell a dark secret, something connected to the house's history. Vara glanced at Jacob, hesitating before asking, "So, Marta was your wife, right?" Her voice was full of curiosity, but also laced with caution. Jacob sighed, his eyes clouded with a hint of sadness. "Yes. Did Geralt tell you? Have you seen her in this house? Do you know her?" he asked Vara, his face filled with both hope and anxiety. Vara shook her head slightly, her gaze distant. "Not really. She keeps to herself," she murmured. They continued down the hallway in oppressive silence. At the end, two images of seashells appeared on the wall, like mysterious symbols. These shells seemed to hold tales of time gone by and lingering sorrow, a part of the deep mystery hidden within this cursed house. Jacob looked out at the stained glass window, with images of seashells and strange, monstrous shapes, his gaze turning distant as memories of Marta flooded back. "Yes, Marta was my wife," he said, his voice heavy with sadness. "These seashells, they remind me of her." Vara stood beside him, curiosity in her voice. "Why is that?" Jacob sighed, his eyes focused on distant memories. She liked to think about the stories of seashells, about their lives beneath the sea. She used to collect the most beautiful shells and make necklaces for me. She even talked to a blacksmith about embedding seashells into the hilt of my dagger as a special gift. Happy images of Marta filled Jacob's mind. She would wander along the shoreline, her eyes sparkling as she found a new shell, her hands gently cradling them like small treasures. But then, a dark day came. Jacob swallowed, his voice dropping lower. One day, while Marta was gathering shells, something rose from the depths of the sea. He could see it clearly, the enormous, terrifying tentacles emerging from the water, slithering towards Marta, enveloping her like a nightmare. The monstrous appendages wrapped around her body, tightening, pulling her slowly toward the endless darkness of the deep. Jacob stopped, his gaze lost and filled with pain. The story wasn't over, but the memory of that horrific moment had left a wound in his heart, an unhealed scar that haunted him endlessly. Jacob recalled the horrifying moment by the shore that day when he saw monstrous tentacles emerge from the water, wrapping around Marta, pulling her toward the depths of the sea. Thankfully, he had arrived just in time before she was completely submerged in the cold water. With all his strength and determination, he threw himself into the fight, struggling against the tentacles to pull Marta back, saving her from the clutches of the terrible creature. After that ordeal, although Marta was safe, she bore the dreadful marks left by the monster. Bruises, the harsh imprints of the tentacles, like cold, sharp blades, served as a constant reminder to Jacob of the death that had nearly claimed the woman he loved. Those scars weren't just on her skin. They had left a mark on his soul, a reminder of the fear and the proximity of death that haunted him. After that, Jacob spoke, his voice rough as if dredged from the depths of his pain. All I could think about was the monsters out there and how many hideous creatures still lurk in this world. He paused, his gaze fixed and distant. How many terrible beings remain hidden that we don't know of? And Marta, she was never safe. He stopped, his haunted eyes staring into the empty space. She was never safe. His words hung in the air like a bitter truth, a painful acceptance that his love for Marta had been powerless to shield her from the cruel, merciless world. Geralt stood before the stained glass window, the dim light casting eerie shadows across the strange images. Vara moved closer to Jacob, curiosity in her voice as she asked, "When did you two meet? How long have you known her?" Jacob replied, his voice filled with a soft, nostalgic tone. "Since she was 10 years old." He began to recount an old memory, from when Marta was just a young girl selling pastries in the village. She would go around with a basket full of sweets, her face bright with smiles, her voice as clear and cheerful as a songbird's. Jacob would often follow her, at first only wanting to buy those delicious pastries, but over time, his feelings for Marta grew deeper. At first, I followed her for those pastries, but as she grew up, everything changed. Jacob's gaze grew distant, as if he could see the Marta of those past days, a young girl with a radiant smile, carrying pastries and filling the village with her song. Vara nodded softly, understanding the memories and emotions Jacob held for Marta. "I think we all know. A different kind of sweetness," she said, her voice gentle yet layered with meaning. Jacob let out a faint smile, a hint of sorrow in his eyes. Yes, Marta was. Jacob's words trailed off, but it seemed no one needed him to finish. Meanwhile, Geralt stood silently, transfixed by the stained glass image of seashells. Drawn to the strange details, he reached out and took down one of the panels, holding it carefully in his hands. His sharp eyes examined every line and color, as if seeking out some hidden clue buried in its imagery. The seashell panel seemed to hold a story of its own, a whisper from the past waiting to be uncovered. Jacob looked around the room with a worried gaze, unable to stand still. "I can't just stay here. I have to find her," he said, his voice resolute. He turned to Geralt and Vara. "You two stay here. I fear she won't show herself if others are around." Vara raised an eyebrow in surprise, asking, "You're planning to go alone in this house? That's not safe." Jacob replied with a determined look, his voice laced with pain but unwavering. "Of course it's not safe, but love has never been safe. I won't lock away my heart like a coward." With that, Jacob turned and strode off, leaving Geralt and Vara standing alone in the hallway. As they watched him disappear, a slight tension lingered between Geralt and Vara. The silence grew thick, each of them seemingly caught in thoughts about their recent misunderstanding. Finally, Vara broke the silence with a mischievous grin and a raised voice. "You had nothing to say to that, did you, Witcher?" she teased, her tone light and mocking. Geralt gave her a steady look but said nothing in response, his face as unreadable as ever. Vara smirked, her eyes sparkling with amusement. "Amusing? Very amusing, she continued, her spirits clearly lifted. I'm not bored anymore. It was almost startling how quickly she had shifted from her earlier fear to this playful mood, her lively personality now on full display. Moments ago, she had been frightened and tense, but now, standing beside Geralt, she seemed thoroughly entertained and couldn't resist needling the stoic witcher beside her. Vara turned to Geralt, a mysterious smile playing on her lips. Come on, I have something to show you, she said, her tone challenging. Geralt raised an eyebrow, responding warily. Again? Last time you said that, I nearly got killed. Vara just chuckled unfazed. Life is made of rich experiences, Witcher. Would you rather die of boredom than of adventure? Her eyes sparkled as she continued. But this time, what I want to show you is just stained glass. Stained glass. Geralt repeated skeptically as they walked down a long hallway lined with glittering stained glass windows. Have you noticed all the stained glass in this house? I think this is where they were made. Vara explained as they entered a large room resembling a glass workshop, with various colored glass pieces and tools scattered across the tables. Geralt glanced around the room and asked curiously, A glass workshop? So who works here? Vara shrugged, her gaze filled with mystery. I've never seen anyone here, but I have seen Marta around this area a few times. Perhaps she's our mysterious glass artisan. Vara paused, her sharp eyes meeting Geralt's, her voice laden with meaning. Tell me, do you think Jacob truly loves her? Do you think Marta loves him? Geralt maintained his usual stoic expression, answering in an even tone. I'm a witcher. Love isn't something I can claim to understand. Vara simply watched him, her eyes thoughtful. Geralt said nothing more, reaching out to pick up a piece of stained glass from the table. He observed it quietly. In the glass, his own reflection stared back at him. Yet there was something deeper, something hidden, colors and shapes that seemed to tell a story long forgotten, a mystery veiled in the vivid hues of the glass. Vara looked at Geralt, her eyes soft yet tinged with a hint of skepticism. Such lies, Geralt. Please don't pretend love is but another monster you can vanquish, she said, her voice gentle but full of emotion, as if trying to shake Geralt's rigid view on love and life. She stepped closer, placing her hand lightly on the hilts of his swords with a gesture that was both gentle and firm. As though challenging the emotional walls he'd built, she continued with a sly tone. If that's the case, which sword do you think you'd use to fight it? Silver or steel? Or perhaps you'd reach for something altogether different. Geralt's face remained cold, his gaze steady and unmoved. Love. There's no place for it in a witcher's life, he replied, his voice deep and resolute. Vara smiled, her eyes glinting with a touch of humor and understanding. I do mean well, she said softly, her tone gentle but sincere. Geralt shrugged, his gaze distant. Anyway, most people mean well, but that rarely matters. After a moment of silence, Geralt unexpectedly spoke. Care to step outside? Vara shrugged lightly, replying with a cheerful yet cautious air. All right, but don't go too far. Who knows which is more dangerous, this house or the forest? But I do know one thing. The forest doesn't forgive as easily as we might hope. They stepped outside, blending into the dim afternoon light, venturing into the forest surrounding the house. The two figures walked quietly, absorbed in their own thoughts yet united in facing the forest's mysteries, the shadows deepening as they ventured forward, each prepared to confront the secrets waiting to be uncovered. As the two ventured deeper into the forest, the light faded beneath the dense canopy of trees. Vara turned to Geralt, her eyes sparkling with a hint of mischief. Hold my hand, if it's not too much to ask, she said with a playful tone. I promise not to fall in love. I know that would be terrifying. Geralt smirked slightly, his reply calm yet tinged with dry humor. Nothing scarier than a woman bored. Vara shook her head, a small smile playing on her lips. Romantic as always. You certainly know what not to say, she retorted half teasing, her eyes filled with amusement. As they continued walking, the surroundings grew darker. Ancient wooden pillars loomed into view, arranged in a circle, with human skulls affixed atop them, adding an eerie air. Hidden among the trees, pairs of bright green eyes belonging to black wolves watched their every step, glowing in the shadows like spectral figures. Vara paused, gesturing toward the distant sound of birds singing. The nightingales. They're trying to lead us somewhere, back to the house. Have you noticed? Geralt nodded, his hand gripping the hilt of his sword tightly. I have, and my medallion seems to agree, he said, his voice calm but edged with tension. In the forest shadows, strange noises echoed from all directions, as if countless creatures were lurking in the underbrush and treetops, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Both Geralt and Vara stood still, prepared to face whatever might be hiding within the deep, dark forest. As they continued deeper into the forest, Geralt and Vara found themselves walking past eerie wooden posts topped with skulls, silent warnings from the darkness. Vara glanced at Geralt with a hint of mischief in her eyes. You'd think we'd be wise enough to heed the warnings, wouldn't you? She remarked. I'd think so, yes, Geralt replied, his tone calm yet wary. Still, they pressed forward, ignoring the ominous signs, curiosity guiding their steps. Vara tilted her head, clearly intrigued. And yet, here we are, still walking. It's curious. After a moment, she turned to Geralt with a thoughtful expression. Tell me, Geralt, Jacob says he's known Marta since she was 10? He eventually married her. Then, at some point, she was killed by a Bruxy and became one herself. Vara pressed, skeptical. Geralt remained stoic. That's the story I heard. Vara looked at him intently. Bruxy are not born in this manner. Yet your friend tells this impossible story to a witcher. Geralt sighed, admitting, Curious, I know. It's the one reason I decided to come along and then enter the house. She looked at him quizzically. Then why are you trying to leave now? Because occasionally I remember what curiosity did to the cat, Geralt replied dryly. Vara chuckled, though there was a hint of understanding in her gaze. So do I. But I suppose curiosity is something you can indulge in when you have lives to spare. As they walked on, the shadows deepened around them and a pair of luminous, hungry eyes watched from the darkness, following their every step. Geralt and Vara ventured deeper into the forest, following a narrow, winding path that led them to a grim and eerie place. Dark stone pillars jutted out of the ground like the teeth of some ancient beast, creating a scene reminiscent of an ancient burial ground. The atmosphere was thick with tension and an ominous chill. Suddenly, from between the shadowed stones, a ghastly creature emerged, its skin a sickly gray and eyes glowing like embers. It muttered in a rasping, haunting voice, "Pretty birds. Pretty little birds." The two halted, their senses on high alert as they took in their eerie surroundings. Vara looked at Geralt, a wry smirk forming as she muttered, "I never thought I'd say this to a man, but I think we've gone too far." Geralt replied dryly, "Your sense of humor does you credit. Most people wouldn't think to joke in a forest as dangerous as this." Vara smiled slyly, her eyes sparkling with mischievous intrigue. "Most people wouldn't call a succubus a person either," she added, leaning closer to Geralt. "I do think we should make our way back to—" Suddenly, a loud caw echoed from above, interrupting her. A horde of crows burst from the treetops, filling the air with the frenzied flapping of wings and piercing cries. Startled, Vara let out a sharp cry, instinctively raising her arms as she and Geralt tried to shield themselves from the onslaught of birds. The two of them were quickly engulfed in a cloud of black feathers and screeching calls, the eerie atmosphere of the forest closing in around them even tighter. The swarm of crows surged forward like a living shadow, darkening the air around Geralt and Vara. As the birds whirled and twisted together, they formed an ominous, writhing mass. Suddenly, they scattered in all directions, revealing the towering figure of a less hen, its twisted antlers reaching skyward. its hollow eyes glowing with a fierce, primal rage. The creature let out an ear-splitting roar that reverberated through the forest. In the shadows around the Leshen, wolves emerged, their eyes gleaming like cold embers. They circled their master, baring teeth, their deep, resonant howls joining the Leshen's cry, creating a symphony of dread that filled the air. "Damn! You were right, Vara. We have gone too far. Back to the house now," Geralt yelled, pushing Vara backward, his voice tense but controlled. As he stepped forward to protect her retreat, he raised his hand, summoning the Igni sign. A burst of fire erupted from his palm, blazing through the sky and igniting the crows that had begun to dive toward them. The birds screeched in pain, their burning bodies plummeting to the ground in a shower of embers. Vara didn't waste a moment, her breath quickening as she turned and fled, disappearing into the shadows of the forest. Behind her, the Leshen snarled, undeterred by the flames. With unnatural speed, it charged toward Geralt, each heavy step echoing as it closed the distance, its form growing larger and more menacing with every stride. The Leshen charged with terrifying speed, its clawed arm lashing out toward Geralt. Reacting just in time, Geralt raised his sword to block the brutal blow. But the monstrous strength behind the Leshen's attack was overwhelming. Geralt was thrown back, his body hurtling through the air before slamming hard into a nearby tree. Meanwhile, Vara had already sprinted halfway to safety. The crash behind her made her heart skip a beat. She turned, eyes widening in horror as she saw Geralt lying by the tree. Without a second thought, she dashed back, fear evident in her voice as she shouted, "Geralt!" Geralt struggled to his feet, the impact leaving him momentarily dazed. He muttered under his breath, "Shit," his voice rough with frustration. Vara reached his side, helping him steady himself. She began to ask, "Geralt, are you?" Her voice trembling. Geralt cut her off, urgency flashing in his eyes. "We have to leave this place. Now!" Leshens draw their power from these totems. As he spoke, Vara's gaze drifted around, taking in the eerie totems hanging from the trees, bones, skulls, and strange talismans, each one pulsing with an unnatural energy. Her skin prickled with dread. "There are so many," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. Geralt gripped her hand firmly, pulling her toward the direction they had come. "Run," he commanded, his voice carrying a mixture of resolve and urgency. The creatures chased them relentlessly, their snarls and growls echoing through the dense forest. The wolves were the fastest, their claws tearing up the earth as they closed in on Geralt and Vara. Geralt couldn't afford to keep running. He turned abruptly, raising his hand, and with a fierce shout, unleashed an Ard. A shockwave exploded outward, slamming into the wolves and sending them tumbling back, buying them a brief moment, but just enough for the Leshen to catch up. With a bone-chilling hiss, the Leshen swung its massive clawed arm in a deadly arc, slicing through the air with a sinister, whistling sound. Geralt dodged just in time, his face a mask of steely determination, though a muttered "damn" escaped his lips as he narrowly avoided the blow. Not wasting a second, Geralt threw up his hand again, this time casting Igni. "Damn birds! Burn!" he shouted as flames erupted, engulfing the swarm of crows diving toward them. The birds shrieked in pain, their charred feathers scattering in fiery bursts as they fell, creating a brief respite amid smoke and ashes. Gripping Vara's hand tightly, Geralt pulled her forward once more, urging her on through the dense undergrowth. They ran, dodging branches and weaving between ancient trees, their breaths labored but unyielding. Behind them, Vara cast a terrified glance, taking in the sight of burning feathers and the shadowy figure of the Leshen advancing through the haze. As they sprinted through the forest, a sudden and unexpected sound pierced the chaos. The soft, pure song of a lone bird, singing brightly from a high branch, untouched by the magic or violence below. Its innocent melody rang out in defiance of the destruction, a single note of tranquility amid the terror, reminding them, for a fleeting moment, of the peace that once existed in these woods. Vara looked up, her gaze following the songbirds chirping above. A faint smile played on her lips, a mix of relief and amusement. Songbirds now? Have we reached the edge of the Lushan's territory? Are we safe? Geralt looked back at the dense forest, still tense. Yeah, I think so. They turned, watching the spot where the less hen had been chasing them. The creature stood in the distance, half hidden behind a tree. Its hollow eyes stared at them, considering whether to pursue. But after a moment, as if deciding they were no longer worth the effort, it turned and vanished into the shadows, leaving them behind. Geralt let out a sigh, but immediately turned to Vara with a hint of frustration in his eyes. That's the second fight where you've done nothing, Vara. As a succubus, you're a creature of some power. Why didn't you help me? Vara stood still for a beat, then smirked, a mischievous gleam in her eyes. Who says I didn't? Geralt frowned, clearly puzzled. Vara's lips curled into a playful, provocative smile. Without another word, she slipped the straps of her dress off her shoulders and let it fall, pooling around her feet. She stood there, completely bare under the dim forest light, her skin smooth as moonlight, her curves flowing with a sensual grace. Her slender waist, bare shoulders, and long, dark hair cascading down her back only accentuated the allure of her succubus form. Her body was mesmerizing, every inch exuding temptation and raw beauty, like a vision crafted from seduction itself. Her eyes sparkled with a playful fire, lips curved in that ever-teasing smile. She stepped closer to him, her voice soft but dripping with mischief. I gave you something to live for. Geralt froze, his face darkening as he processed her boldness. For a moment, he was at a loss for words, caught between irritation and a reluctant smile. Only a succubus, he thought, would find such a way to help in the middle of a deadly chase. As Vara stepped closer to Geralt, her fingers traced along his jawline, her touch soft and lingering. The space between them seemed to thicken with tension, a charged silence hanging in the air. It was as if, in that fleeting moment, they were on the brink of surrendering to something primal, closing the distance for a kiss, letting go of restraint. But just as their breaths mingled and the world seemed to narrow down to just the two of them, a sudden, jarring sound shattered the intimacy. Bong! 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 Vara flinched, pulling back with a start, her brows knitting together in a mix of irritation and fear. Geralt, ever stoic, didn't flinch. His face remained unreadable, but it was hard to tell if his expression masked disappointment or quiet relief. He murmured, "Huh?" His tone as steady as always, even as the bells continued their relentless toll. The somber clang reverberated through the trees, echoing louder, more insistent. Vara, now composed, slipped back into her dress, pulling the fabric up over her shoulders as she muttered, "Bells." Her voice was filled with a sense of dread, as if the sound carried a dark significance. Geralt's gaze shifted toward the distance. "Sounds like they're coming from the house," he observed, his tone calm yet wary. The ringing grew louder, almost oppressive, and with each peal, something terrible unfolded around them. All at once, songbirds began to fall from the trees, their fragile bodies thudding against the ground in morbid rhythm with the bells. Feathers drifted through the air like dark confetti, and lifeless forms scattered at their feet, painting a grim picture of death. Geralt, Vara's voice was soft, almost trembling as she took in the horrifying scene. The songbirds are dying. They stood in silence, surrounded by the fallen birds and the echoing chimes, a sense of foreboding hanging over them like a shroud. It was as if something terrible had unfolded within the mysterious house they'd left behind. An urgency lingered in the air. They needed to return to that house immediately. A gnawing fear whispered that something even more dreadful could happen if they didn't get back soon.